Alright, today we're going to start our first set of flipped classroom guided notes. And as doing so, I would like to kind of give expectations for this. Looking at your notes, you're going to see on the left side a notes for or from class box. Essentially what that's used for is to kind of write down things that you have questions about, that you're not sure about, that you would like to ask questions in class later, or that you need clarification on. That's kind of your side area for stuff that's not directly from the PowerPoint. The rest of it should flow along pretty well in order, meaning that if you don't want to use these videos, using the PowerPoints that are also hosted on the class website is perfectly acceptable, and we'll go through and get you the exact same information because there you see the PowerPoints right in front of you. We're actually going to be writing on them. So with that being said, I'd like to start up with the nature of scientists. It's basically how scientists think, even though for the longest time you've heard it called the scientific method. Basically, science as a whole is a way and goal of understanding the natural world we live in, whether we're talking plants or animals or the ocean or geology or the universe itself, trying to figure out how and why it works in a given manner so that we can use those predictions, use the hows, use the whys to our benefit. Scientists will go through and try to explain how the world is working and how certain situations occur. And before they actually start their research, they're going to go through and hypothesize what's occurring, because that will lead them in a given direction. And when we get into that, we need to kind of think about what science is. Science should be questioning everything all the time. Whether it's something that you know is quote-unquote a fact, it is still something that is not above scientific reasoning and should continue to be questioned and tested over and over to ensure that what we know now is still holds true to what we knew 100 years ago, 50 years ago, 20 years ago, when it was quote-unquote proven or supported by evidence of an experiment. Success as a scientist, or success as a scientific method, basically comes from being creative and setting up an experiment and thinking outside the box. Some of the most amazing experiments don't really seem like something that would have been intuitive, but end up being wonderful because of how creative they were. And in addition to that, going through and being very, very persistent is something that you have to do. If we think about Thomas Edison and when he invented the light bulb, he's quoted saying that after testing 9,000 different things to work as a filament for the light bulb, he said, "I know 9,000 ways in which it won't work, and I'm really close to figuring out which one will." So if he can try to figure out over 10,000 times what would work to make a light bulb light up, I think that shows that you need to continue trying and trying and trying, because slight tweaks here and there can be the success or lead to the success that you need. Basically, you need to go through, when creating an experiment, is finding a way to make your questions meaningful and make them be able to be something that you can set up an experiment and test. Having a question is great, but having a question that you can actually set up an experiment and run tests on is what we're looking for with the way that scientists think. How can I support this hypothesis that I have? And starting that off, our idea of scientific inquiry starts with observation. Basically observing the natural world around you, finding something you have a question about and saying, I'm going to look at that. The second thing we're doing, and we talked about the question that we were going to ask, but after you figure out what do I want to look at, you need to do some research on the subject. What do other people already know about it? What is other research support on this? Because standing on the shoulders of other great men will lead your research in a great, great direction. After we go through and do all this research and find out what other people know, you are going to form a hypothesis, which is your educated guess that is based on research. The research portion based on research is massively important, because it's not just a guess. It is a guess based on what you know and what the scientific community knows. Okay? So I want you to not just think of the word guess, because guess is almost misleading. It is based on research. After we form the hypothesis, we need to actually test the hypothesis, and this is where the experiment comes into play. The biggest portion of your scientific method, or the way that a scientist thinks, or the inquiry process, is going to be the experiment itself. Within an experiment, you are essentially setting up two different groups that are going to be exposed to the same process. There is only one difference between those two groups, and that's what we call the independent variable. It's going to be the factor that you change on purpose. So if we were going to go through and test something about cars, hey, which car is going to go through and drive 100 meters fastest, or a mile fastest, the thing that we might change would be the size of the engine. Would the size of the engine affect how quickly a car could traverse a 1 mile track? Okay, there can only be one independent variable, because if you have more than one independent variable, you never know what actually caused that change. The dependent variable is going to be the result of what changed. So, for instance, if we change the size of the engine, we are hoping that the speed of the car is what changed. Or on a completely different example, if you're going through and trying to determine if the amount of fertilizer causes plants to grow better, well, the dependent variable, the thing that you change by adding fertilizer, would hopefully be the growth rate of plants. So we have these two groups. One of them has the independent variable applied to it, the other does not. Every other thing within that experiment is going to be a constant, a factor that you keep identical to keep the comparison and the trial fair, so that you know whether your one independent variable worked or not. In the case of our car, we're going to go through and we're going to try setting up so that they test on the same track, with the exact same car, with the exact same time, and the exact same weather conditions, and the same driver, so that the only difference between those two cars is the engine itself. So that if there is a difference in speed, you know it's accounting towards that engine size. Okay? And this is where a control group and our experimental group comes into play. The control group is going to be the group that did not receive the independent variable. It should be a group that you already know the results of. And I hate to say know the results of, but it should be something that you know. You are testing the independent variable. So for example, we are trying to figure out if a larger engine is going to make a car go faster. Well, the group that did not get the larger engine, did not's the key there, is going to end up being your control group. You know what a normal size engine will do. We're trying to see what happens if the engine gets bigger. So the control group is the group that receives no treatment. Your experimental group is the group that has the independent variable. So in our case of the car, it's the car that has a bigger engine. We're trying to see if that bigger engine will make the car faster. And within the experiment, obviously, you want to repeat trials. Now, I'm not saying you pull a Thomas Edison and go out and do 10,000 lengths, but you should repeat your trials enough that you have good data, whether it be 5 times, whether it be 10 times, whether it be 100 times or 1,000 times. You should repeat your trials so that you're not doing an experiment just once. And this is done because scientists always confirm results. So whether you're going through and repeating the trial, or another scientist is going through and confirming the results, experiments will be done over and over and over. And the more that we can increase the trials, the more that you're going to increase the confidence in your results. If I ask one person something, or I do a trial once, I'm mildly confident. If I run that same test with the cars 100 times, I'm going to be pretty confident in what those results are. And I'm going to figure out my total results by taking the average of all of these stuff to reduce error. Okay? When I go through and I take data, essentially we have 2 types of data, and your data is going to be your evidence. It is what you observe. Observe is your key word here. It is not anything that you think. Evidence can be measured, or it can be figured out using observations from one's senses, but it is not what you think. And I told you we had 2 types of data. Basically, we have quantitative, which is stuff that is measured with numbers, such as growth rate, speed, height, length, mass, volume, stuff along those lines. We have qualitative data, data that are described using words. and that basically means we're using the senses. And those are going to be color, texture, looks healthier, feels softer, tastes better, stuff along those lines. Following up the experiment, after you've gone through and collected all of your data, in which you have both quantitative and qualitative data, we're going to go through and make a conclusion. And essentially a conclusion is going through and restating what your hypothesis is. And you need to state whether your data, so you're not referring to what you think or what you feel, but what did the data say, and did the data support or reject the hypothesis? Notice how we never used the word proved. Okay, you can't prove that a hypothesis was correct. You can say that the data was supported, the data supported the hypothesis, or that the data rejected your hypothesis, but we're not proving anything. Okay? And after we go through and we restate our hypothesis and discuss what the data was actually doing, the most important thing within all this is that you actually share what you learned. You're going to go through and you're going to publish your data to colleagues in journals, whether it be neuroscience or biological or geological or whatever your specific specialty is. You're going to publish this so that other scientists can go through and try to mimic and do your experiment. And as they go through and more scientists go through and run your experiment, and they go through and get the same data that you do and get the same results that you do, and the hypothesis continues to be supported, and the more solid that the idea becomes. And once the scientific idea is widely accepted, it will continue to be experimented on. Every time a new experiment is run, new information is going to be learned. Gravity itself was initially proposed and thought of back with Sir Isaac Newton in the 1600s, and today, 400 years later, we are still running experiments basically on gravity. So as you continue to go through and continue to test, we will continue to learn more and more and more.